Mike Pence is now officially in the presidential race. He has made a campaign ad that I watched this morning. And Debbie and I were talking about this over breakfast, and we were just trying to make sense of the Mike Pence phenomenon. Now, making sense of the Mike Pence phenomenon involves more than Mike Pence, because it involves other people like Mike Pence who are also running, but running kind of to what end? And with what sort of a vision and what sort of a platform? I'm thinking here of Nikki Haley. I'm thinking here of who else? Asa Hutchinson. I guess Chris Christie is now in the race as well. And all of these people seem to be kind of looking at the country and seeing it in a completely different way than certainly Debbie and I do, and I think most likely you do also. Now, Mike Pence in his ad talks about the fact that he wasn't willing to overturn the election. He didn't think he had the power to do that. But wait a minute, nobody asked him to do that. No one said to Mike Pence, you overturn the election. The idea was simply to send the electoral process back to the states who have ultimate constitutional jurisdiction over that process and ask them to take another look. So this was not an attempt to change the outcome of an election. It was rather an attempt to arrive at a correct outcome in the first place. And so, look, I mean, when you start misrepresenting what you're even asked to do, you're not off to a very good start. Mike Pence does a lot about talking about his own kind of rectitude and his own integrity. I call these guys, I think Debbie actually used the phrase first, these are the people who are like, we're better than that. And by that they mean we're better than the Democrats. The Democrats can do all kinds of gangsterism, but we're not going to do the same. Well, the question then arises, if you're not going to do the same, how do you plan to defeat them? By standing on principle, by looking tough, by appealing to your own incorruptibility. What is your actual strategy? I mean, let's look at the analogy of the Democrats in the 1850s. They were becoming increasingly gangsterized. They were threatening to break up the country and launch a major war. And Abraham Lincoln realized, listen, the tactics of the 1840s and early 50s are not going to work in the late 1850s and the early 1860s. Why? Because the storm clouds of war are on the horizon. So in a combat mode, we need a Republican Party that's appropriate to the occasion. Well, we're not in a civil war like that, but we are in a cold civil war. And Mike Pence doesn't seem to know that. Now, look at all this evidence that's coming out now about the level of Biden corruption. $5 million bribes, collecting money under the table from Ukraine, from China, distributing it in a suitcase to members of the Biden family. This is mafia-style behavior. Well, what makes you think that the same mafioso that are doing this kind of corrupt shenanigans would somehow be above rigging an election or bending the rules or figuring out ways to cheat any which way they can to get them across the finish line? Anyone who thinks that they wouldn't do that has no idea what they're up against. We're not up against the bumbling incompetence of Jimmy Carter. We're up against something far more malevolent. And by the way, Jimmy Carter wasn't an angel either. He had his own malevolent side, but perhaps not as bad as Obama and not as bad as Biden. So this is the problem. We have Republicans today, and the problem is it's not just Mike Pence. It was just Mike Pence. I would just put it down to cluelessness, a certain being frozen in a time warp, living still in the Reagan era and thinking that those same slogans. I mean, when you listen to Pence and you listen even to Nikki Haley, they do sound out of the 1980s. I mean, it seems to be out of place, if you will, in today's situation. They don't talk about even the issues that matter today. even when they're dealing with Ukraine, they act as if the Soviet Union is still in place. And so the same antagonism that all of us showed toward the Soviet Union in the 1980s is somehow now transplanted onto Putin today, even though we're talking about a completely different regime and a completely different system and completely different facts on the ground. Ukraine is very distant from America. The Soviet Union was threatening to come through the Fulda Gap into West Germany. So in other words, the United States was fighting for Europe's survival and its own. That is not the case manifestly now in Ukraine. So it would be nice to have a Mike Pence who stepped forward and said, hey, listen, this is why we should still back Ukraine. This is why the situation is not much different from how it was in the 1980s. So an intellectual case for why people like me are wrong and why people like him are right would be good to hear. But so far, and I don't think it's coming, he hasn't made that case.